Welcome to the Playing Hooky podcast with your hosts Rachel and Nathan, brought to you by UtilityMuffinLabs.com. Consistently rated adequate.
Welcome everybody to the Playing Hooky podcast. My name is Rachel.
And I'm Nathan. I am slouchy.
Oh, that's okay, Nathan. You're allowed to be slouchy after a long day of hard work.
Yeah.
It's Saturday. We've done no work.
Well, the work that we've done is we've tried to be amateur podcasters here, or amateur broadcasters, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I would say you're a professional podcaster.
I'm an annoyed podcaster, but anyways, that doesn't matter.
Why are you an annoyed podcaster?
Because nothing ever works, right? Like technology never functions properly. It never does what you want it to do. When you set something up, you should be able to walk away and come back to it later, and it works exactly how you left it.
I have a secret for you. I'm pretty sure every human being has faced this trouble since the dawn of civilization. And there's like a caveman who like made a wheel, and like the wheel didn't turn the same way it did previously, or the workload was harder, and so he had to like adjust the axle or whatever. Mm-hmm. And he was like, "Oh, I'm fucking going to cave. Should work same each time."
Right. I had a caveman moment here, so
it's all good. You're not alone in that. I'm sure we've all of our 4 or 5 listeners have had their share of caveman moments in the past couple of weeks, dealing with the holidays and what have you. But what were you going to say?
I was going to say that also the attitude that I had towards this stuff, trying to get it to function properly, is the exact same reason why I don't play video games anymore. Yeah. Why like when I play video games, I get that way. If it doesn't work exactly how I want it to, I pitch a fit. So
please reference the Nerd Words podcast for a full tale on how Nathan destroyed a box fan, an innocent box fan.
Yeah.
But that is a tale for another podcast. On this podcast today, the Playing Hooky podcast, as promised, we are reviewing 2 different comic books. But first, I would like to say to our listeners, apologies for being so late into the new year to get our first podcast of the new year out. We, the holidays are busy, as you all know. Lots of visiting family, lots of eating food, lots of presents. Right. As much work as it is fun and enjoyable, or it can be, sometimes it can be very stressful depending on your family situation. And, we didn't have time really between my work schedule, Nathan's work schedule, his podcasting schedule, and my like self-inflicted writing schedule to get through these graphic novels. And I will admit that for me, getting through Spider-Man Maximum Carnage was a bit of a slog. It was, so I have been taking the bus in the New Year's, like a New Year's resolution. So
I'm so slouchy.
It's okay. Don't worry about it. We're recording this on video as well for you listeners. Eventually it may find its way on YouTube or not. Who knows?
No, it'll get there.
That's a promise
good or bad,
from Nathan of UML.
There.
It'll get there.
It'll get there.
We also Nathan read Sandman, Preludes and Nocturnes, the first, I think, 12 issues of the Sandman series. But as I was saying, I was, taking the bus a lot more in the new year. One, just trying to save a little bit of money on gas, trying to be environmentally friendly, but also, really, I need to save for a new car. And what better way to save for a new car than to cut down on driving your regular car?
Right.
So it's been a really, I actually kind of like taking the bus. It reminds me of when I was a kid. I used to take the bus everywhere all the time. And one of the great things about taking the bus or public transportation, if you have subways in your city, is that you can kind of just spend that time just chilling out. You can do whatever you want to do. You can listen to podcasts, you can read, you can listen to music, you can just be alone with your thoughts, without the burden of having to not kill yourself in like a 2-ton vehicle or others around you, right? So I was reading Maximum Carnage almost every single day on the bus to work and the bus home. And I will say that one of the benefits of that is that I made a lot of new friends. It turns out that if you're reading a Spider-Man comic on the bus and you're like a nerdy librarian type white girl, it's a conversation starter. I mean, most people aren't expecting like a woman in her who's actually in her mid-30s, but I'd like to say just looks like she's in her late 20s, early 30s, reading a comic book. And so I had quite a few people, mostly men, just start conversations with me. And so that was kind of cool. It was like a nice icebreaker, and it was very like a non-threatening way for people to kind of start chatting to me, which was nice. And everybody was really cool. Nobody wasn't creepy bus people, One guy was like, "Oh, did you see the Venom movie?" And he was telling me about it. And he's like, "Oh yeah, it looks like maybe Woody Harrelson's gonna be Carnage if they make a sequel." And I was like, "Oh, that would be cool." And then another guy bus was full. Guy sat down right next to me, and if you're a woman riding the bus, usually people don't sit down next to you unless it's really crowded. Everyone tries to give each other their space. Dude sat down next to me, didn't really pay any attention to him, and then he's like taps me on the shoulder, and he's like, "Did you see Into the Spider-Verse?" And I was like, "No, not yet." And he's like, "It's really hot." I was like, "Okay." So he's like, "You should definitely check it out." And then dude goes back to like watching whatever movie he was watching on his cell phone. So it was pretty cool. It was fun. But despite the half-hour commute in the morning and the evening, I just had a really hard time making it through that comic. And I know you said that the Sandman was also a little bit of a challenge for you. Was that just because of your reading schedule surrounding 25 years of Vampire the Masquerade? Or?
It was mostly because of my reading schedule. So for those of you that don't know, and I don't know how this would be possible, but I do another podcast where we do weekly book reviews. So, and they're all like game books. So yeah, those average anywhere between like 95 pages and 300 pages for some of them. The one that I had to read this week.
Please continue.
No.
I have to get a book. I'm listening. My notes.
That's okay.
This is the trouble with video. Is that we can't just like walk away while the other one keeps talking.
Right. So.
Oh well.
All right.
So your reading schedule was pretty demanding?
My reading schedule was demanding. I had to read a 300-page game book plus 2 chapters from another book, like I'm in school.
Yeah.
And then I had to read this as well. This I didn't have to read all in one week. And I didn't actually read all in one sitting. I read it in a couple of sittings. Comic books are they're not a challenge for me to read. I can usually get through them really quickly.
Right.
And it's because it's very little words, a lot of art. The challenge that I had was in a lot of ways, the artwork in these left a little bit for me to be desired. I didn't really care for it, which is kind of sad because the artist that did the majority of the artwork in here is Sam Keith, who I like. Sam Keith is the guy that created The Max. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yep.
Used to be an old MTV show. But
that's how I'm familiar with it.
I just I didn't really care for it. It was just like it wasn't very consistent. But that's okay. Like I can live with it.
Right.
Actually, all things considered, I'm really glad that I read it. However, I feel like it has a lot of similarities with like it has a very Beetlejuice feel. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's very gothy. You can tell that
it's very gothy.
That Neil Gaiman was clearly into The Cure and like Bauhaus and.
I mean, have you seen a picture of Neil Gaiman? You can see a picture of Neil Gaiman on the back. This picture is probably about 10 years old. But I don't know if you can see that on camera or not. But yeah, I mean, he's a forlorn, shaggy-haired individual.
Yeah, I'd always heard that, and it was part of the reason why I never bothered to read any Sandman, because like the Sandman was always kind of like the goth staple, and from like the gaming community and Vampire the Masquerade community, like there's a lot of people that are into that stuff, and I tend to just be like, if everybody's into it, I tend to be dismissive, and that's just a fault in my own personality.
Right.
But nevertheless, I'm glad that I read it. It's actually really good. It's a really good story.
Yeah. Most Neil Gaiman stuff is.
So, want some trivia about Spider-Man Maximum Carnage before we talk about how much of a slog it was?
Sure, please.
So, it was so popular, it was turned into a video game.
Okay.
I don't know of any other like video game. I don't know of any other comic book plot line specific thing except maybe the death of Superman. I can't recall, but I can't remember any other comic book plot line that was turned into a video game. And the video game soundtrack was done by Green Jelly.
I don't know what that is.
People watching will probably know what that is. So Green Jelly did the song, the Three Little Pigs song. Okay. Well, anyways, I'll try to find a clip or something. I'll let you. That's a whole other tale. But anyways, a popular rock group at the time.
Okay. In 1993.
In 1993 or 94, did a Super Nintendo game.
Okay. So having read Maximum Carnage now, I can see why it would be made into a video game. So why was this a bit of a slog for me? Well, it's first of all, it is kind of long. It's thick. It's 14 issues, so it's not insignificant. Obviously, I didn't really have much trouble reading it. The artwork was fine. In fact, it was exactly what I expected and exactly what you would want out of a Marvel comic. Right. I think the thing that was just really hard for me that I wasn't expecting, and this is probably shows my inexperience with reading what I would consider to be more traditional superhero comics, is it didn't really have a story. It definitely, I could see it being a video game because really, in my opinion, issues 4 through 11, pointless. They added nothing to the overall story. Kind of pointless. I don't think we really even needed them because they didn't include any story to drive the plot forward. Right. It was just each issue was just introducing more obscure villains and more obscure heroes to fight those obscure villains, and the city being like New York being kind of, shot to hell, and it was a lot of carnage. And it wasn't necessary. So the middle 60-70% of this series was just so boring, and it was really hard. Like I had to put in an effort to read it. Right. But just to kind of, just to give a brief summary, essentially Harry Osborn has just died, who was the Green Goblin. Mary Jane and Peter Parker are at his funeral. So that's kind of where we are in the Spider-Man universe. And then all of a sudden Carnage, who was infected by Venom's symbiote suit, it's kind of mutated and transformed him into this badass, crazy serial killer supervillain. Carnage is in jail, or Carnage is being put in jail, sort of Hannibal Lecter style, and then he escapes. And he starts gathering up all of these other supervillains to, help him bring destruction to the city. Is it Metropolis? Or that's DC. Yeah. It's just New York. It's just New York. Yeah.
Marvel keeps them real.
Yeah. Okay, it's just New York. Yeah. Sometimes I get confused between what's really New York, what's Metropolis, and what's Gotham. I know Gotham's Batman, but I couldn't remember. So sorry. I'm not that savvy.
So an interesting side note to that, I was reading a comic book the other day where they referred to it as upstate Gotham. And I was like, oh, so you're just replacing New York. You're just
upstate Gotham.
Yeah, it's like Gotham City, like Gotham is the state. It's interesting. Anyways, that's different.
So then basically nothing happens.
It was this comic book. I'm dumb.
Oh, it's this comic book. It was Preludes and Nocturnes.
Hey, in the comic I was reading.
Yeah, so Sandman is DC.
Yeah.
So anyway, nothing basically happens after that until Venom comes in, and Venom's like your anti-hero, and he hates Spider-Man and wants to kill Spider-Man, but he also has a moral center, and he's like, I need to right the wrong of Carnage. He is infected by my suit, and so he's killing all these innocent people, so I'm gonna go kill him. So Venom gets involved, and then Venom and Spider-Man team up to go after Carnage, and they have a loose alliance, and then more villains and more superheroes. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, by the end of it, these are just some of the superheroes that were there. There was Spider-Man, there was Venom, who in this comic would be considered a hero, Night Watch, Captain America, Cloak and Dagger, Morbius, the Black Cat. Some of these I'd never heard of before. And then from villains, we had Carnage, we had Shriek, we had Doppelganger, we had Demogoblin, we had others I can't remember. There were so many, and it was just too much. There was no story. Every issue, seriously, issue 4 through 11 was just them flying over the city and fighting, which if you're trying to sell comics to 12-year-old boys, awesome.
Yeah.
You've done your job. That's it. And I could see like each issue being like a different level in a video game where it gets harder and there's more villains to fight, and maybe the different like
you
more
could even make 14 stages.
Yeah, 14 stages, and the more obscure villains or the boss at the end of each level.
Right.
So some things that I noticed that I thought were interesting as I was reading it, though, because it wasn't, completely, it wasn't garbage, right? But I did kind of give like a shitty review earlier. We were talking earlier today, and I finally finished it, and he goes, yeah, so, and I was like, well, and he's like, so you're done with the Carnage, what'd you think? And I was like, well, I'm older now than I was when I started reading it. I have less time left on this earth than when I began. And he's like, that is not a good review.
No.
And it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad. But I would not recommend it to anyone who wasn't like if Marvel is your bag, if you love Spider-Man, you'll love this, right? If you're not really into Marvel and super loyal to
this isn't where you'd want to jump in.
No.
This isn't like where you'd want to start.
No. Because where I started in Marvel was I can't remember exactly what it's called, but I think the first like Marvel comic book I read was like an origin story for Wolverine.
Right.
And it was very well done. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Might have been Origins. Well, it might have been Wolverine Origins.
I think they've done like the origin story of Wolverine a couple of times. So they've probably gotten like this was like at the height of like just oversaturation of comic books. Like they were huge. Like everybody was collecting them. They got very pop culture. Like they're pop culture today in a different way than they were in the 90s. Right.
How do you mean? I don't understand what you mean by pop culture.
So, I mean, like, everybody was buying comic books in the 90s. So, today, we all know these comic book heroes because some of us... Right, because of the movies. Because some of us collected them as a kid. So, it's like something that we all have, like, our toes were always in that pond. But as we got older, they kind of matured it. And created these films, and like movies are huge, and so like everybody knows Spider-Man, everybody knows Captain America now, everybody knows Venom. Like even if the movie's not good, people went and saw it. Like it's a superhero movie with a creepy monster. So we all know these characters, but the 90s were kind of like the height of comic book excess. You had like these hero comic book artists like Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld and like all these like Todd McFarlane. Like you had all these people that were like these rock star artists, and they were in denim jeans ads and shit like that. So like comic books in the 90s were huge, and this was just like a showcase. And that's the thing, like there wasn't necessarily story. It was just like a showcase for like all your cool characters. Like what can you tell me, having read this comic book, about a character named Nightwatch?
He's got kind of a cool suit and looks a little bit like Spawn.
Right, like
that's it.
Like that's it.
Yeah,
that's
I don't know anything about him.
And apparently, I was reading up on him before this podcast. Like he's most well known for appearing in this series, and there's no reason for him to exist.
Yeah,
it's just a stupid character. It's just like a bunch of guys like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I did this? And like that's a very 12-year-old mentality, right? Like you get all your GI Joes out and you lay them on the table and you divide your armies and you just have them fight, right? That's what we did.
Right. Well, I would say like my introduction into like superhero comics were kind of more serious books like The Killing Joke or Batman the Long Halloween or like I said, the Wolverine origin story or Sandman, right? So I went in with an expectation that I was going to be getting some good artwork and like a serious story. There was good artwork and there was a shitty story.
So the reason why I brought this to the table was because this was... at 11 or 12 years old, this was what was on the newsstand. Yeah. And this is like, basically, this is what got me into comic books. Like this very basic, like rudimentary tale. And not necessarily this one specifically, but like this era of like Spider-Man and the Avengers and the X-Men. Like the X-Men were like really important to me as a kid. That's what got me to enjoy comic books and really kind of like propelled me down the pop culture road. And so I'm glad that you had the incorrect expectation, because I feel like yours is like a much more refined. What you brought to the table is like it's more of a story.
Yeah.
It's more detailed. There's more going on. And it's kind of a journey through those, like exploring that character and like coming to like the fact that it exists in a comic book world was a little jarring to me, because I felt like it kind of actually took away from the story. But I like that it was, because it's like it reminds you like it's still a comic book.
Yeah.
And so I really like that. But this one, yeah, I just wanted to showcase to you, this is how young nerds become adult nerds. Like it's not because this is a great story. This is a turd. But it's my turd.
Yeah, it has some cool art. I mean,
Right.
I can't lie. But some things I jotted down that I thought were interesting points as I was reading through it is, like, let's see. So Mary Jane and Mary Jane and Peter Parker are on their way back from Harry Osborn's funeral, and then Carnage escapes and he has to deal with it. And Mary Jane's like not happy about that. And Spider-Man zooms off to go try to save the day. But then in a thought bubble in his head was a pretty interesting part of inner dialogue. And he said, "It's like I'm destined to keep fighting them over and over again. I'll never see the last of them." And I was kind of like, oh, like what if all of the characters we create in movies and TV shows and comic books really exist and really lead lives in like another plane of existence, in another parallel universe, and we're just dooming them to fight their demons over and over and over again. And it reminded me of like the Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, where you had to like relive your life over and over and over again, and like the good parts and the bad parts. And I was just like, I was going too deep. It was not meant to be that deep, but I was just like, what if somewhere in some parallel universe, Peter Parker's a real guy and he's just doomed to face these villains over and over again? And he is, because they keep fucking writing him have to fight these villains over and over again.
I would challenge you, because you say, it's just a stupid Spider-Man story. Like, it's not that deep, but like, these guys are authors, right? Like the people that made the comic books, like they're writers. And so they want to write good material. They want to write like deep intellectual thing. Like, who doesn't want to write that way?
Yeah. Well, maybe they're probably constrained by what the product, right?
Well, right. We want you to put out like a Whitesnake album and call it a Spider-Man comic. Like that, you know what I mean? Like that's what's happening. But the other thing too about Carnage, and like why this was like so cool to me, was kind of along the same mentality. Like I'd never seen a comic book where like a bad guy was like just killing people, right? Like at that time, it was very like Comic Code Authority, right? And you can see the little logo on here,
right?
And like, of course, it's not the first example. Like that character's not the first example of that happening, but like it was just so shocking to me the first time I saw Carnage, and like it's really kind of poorly written. It's just like a psychopath.
It's
like
terribly written, yeah.
he's just a slaughter killer.
But they did go into his background a little bit more in the run. And that was the other thing I noted, was that, Carnage, I forget his last name's Cassidy, but Cletus Cassidy. Everything's alliterative in Marvel Comics. Peter Parker, Cletus Cassidy. Carnage talks about his past off and on throughout the run, and there's a serious history of abuse and bullying. I believe his mother tried to kill him, and then he tried to kill his mom, and then his dad tried to kill him because his mom, and then he ended up killing his dad, and his mom ended up killing. Like he had a fucked up most fucked up childhood you could have, right? And then he goes to like an orphanage where he's bullied, and basically society turns him into this twisted individual, and he becomes a serial killer, and then ends up in a jail cell with Venom, and then Venom's suit like infects him, and he becomes Carnage, right? So it kind of gives his history and his backstory, and at one point, it comes up in fight dialogue, and like none of the heroes have any fucks to give. They do not feel any sympathy for him except Peter Parker. Like Peter Parker is the one, or Spider-Man is like the one individual who's like, Carnage has done terrible things, but can we really say he's responsible for his actions when we as a society made him into what he is? And that's a pretty deep thing to start exploring with kids in comics, right? Because it's like, it's a question, it's an ethical question that doesn't really have a good answer. Like, how do you hold people accountable for atrocities that they would not have otherwise committed if they didn't have such horrific, shitty lives as children? And another thing that kind of intrigued me as I was thinking through that is you and I had a conversation a few weeks ago where we were talking about, like, as a percentage of your life, you are a child for such a short amount of that time.
Right, nearly zero.
You look like a child for such a short amount of time, and your brain is, in development for such a short amount of time in your life. Like, what do they say? Like, early 20s were kind of fully developed neurologically. So imagine that, And it's like, that short amount of time in your life, whatever happens to you in that really small amount of time affects your behavior and will ultimately probably affect your choices for the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's really bizarre when you think about it.
It's crazy. Yeah,
like what let's put it like this. You're logically a child for 12 years.
Yeah,
right?
A child. You look like a child.
You are a child for 12 years. I basically worked in my last job that long. It's like,
yeah,
like, but you're always sort of working against or trying to fight all of these things that happen to you as a child and like your development. And it's just like, it's bizarre when you really think about it like that. Like, the things that happen to you in that short period of time will influence you forever for the rest of your life.
Right. So it's like Spider-Man's argument, without being this eloquent, was that, like, how can we kill Carnage? How can we in good conscience kill Carnage when, yes, he's done horrible things, but is he really responsible for his actions when, like, the atrocities that happened to him as a little kid made him this way? And I think that that's like a question that society asks of a lot of criminals, right? So there's that. But I will, like, I have to say right now, because this thought just occurred to me, like, even though this was like a dumb comic book and most of it was a waste of ink, the art was good, but a waste of, story, I would still say that Maximum Carnage is art. It's fucking art. You know why it's art? Because it got me to think. It got me to think about life and society and comic books and just, deeper stuff, right? And that's what art's supposed to do. So even though I kind of shit on it and I would not read it again, I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, it did get me to think. So it's valuable in that way. The only other comment I'll have that really kind of like struck me, and this is just to show how much we've changed in America since 1993. Early on in the run, maybe issue 2, Mary Jane is like stressed out because either she and Peter are recently engaged or recently married, like whatever, they're spending their lives together. It's solidified. And she's kind of like being like, I don't want him to go out and do this, and that might be selfish of me, but I don't want him to get hurt and I don't care. She's really stressed out. And she's like smoking in the comic. She's smoking. And I was like, oh my God. And I always thought of her as being this very wholesome, like nurturing, kind of innocent character. But she's like straight up smoking. And then like later on she says like, oh, I know it's such a dirty habit, but blah, blah, blah. So there's kind of like that like justification that she knows that smoking's naughty. But I was just like, it really struck me as really surprising to see her smoking. Because I don't see, like, now when I see a person smoking, and like smoking a cigarette, not like a Juul or vape pen or anything like that. But when I see
doing a J,
when I see someone smoking a cigarette, I automatically think like I feel bad for that person, right? Because I know it's a really hard, addictive thing to break, and I know that they're really damaging their bodies, and they probably want to quit or know that they should quit and they can't. And it tends to be like, a certain class of people who are doing it, or someone who did it when they were young and thought it was cool and then just got hooked on it and could never, stop, right? You don't see a lot of professionals smoking cigarettes anymore the way you might have in like the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, right? Because most people know it's really, really bad for you and they just don't get started with it. And And so it was just really surprising to see Mary Jane, who was supposed to be sort of a wholesome, middle-class white girl, just like totally like dealing with her stress by, chain smoking. So that was kind of funny, which I thought it was like a sign of the times.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, that's kind of all I have to say about it. Not a great story. Probably could have been about 7 issues shorter. Fun artwork. I'm glad I read it. But there are probably lots of other things I would have rather read.
The crossover was like the king of comic books back then. So
Yeah.
like anybody that grew up reading like mainstream comic books in the 90s knows this is just a sign of the times. Like this comic book, it's so much style over substance.
Right.
It's just meant to like look really cool, and
you get Venom and Carnage and Spider-Man all fighting each other in the same issue, and that's cool, right?
Yeah, and so this was a thing that when I was a kid, I always really wanted, and I searched for and could never find like a one of these graphic novels, one of these like put together like trade paperbacks, and we were at a comic book shop a few months ago, and I just happened to see it, and I was like, "Oh my god!" It was like finding a jewel, It was like finding the Holy Grail when when your dad was Indiana Jones. It was just like it was. But yeah, it's just. I mean, looking at it, I haven't even reread it yet. But just looking at it, it's so symptomatic of the 90s.
One last comment on it that I think is pretty sweet. So J.M. DeMatteis, or DeMatteis, I'm not sure how you say it, is one of the writers. He wrote, I think, about 5 issues, and he had like a nice little afterword from 1994 when the series was done. And he wrote, if there's one thing that remained paramount throughout our struggle to create the epic adventure you've just read, it was our dedication to that idea. So remember, no matter how hard life gets, how brutal the world around us can appear, how inhuman our fellow man sometimes seems, simple human love is the most powerful force in the world, and people are, at heart, as kind, as decent, as compassionate and caring as a guy named Peter Parker. Aww. So it's a nice little sentiment, in a crazy, fucked up world, which, let's be fair, in 1993, if you were an American, the world was looking up. Right? Like, things were, the economy was good. If you were a white person, it was fine, right? It
was like 2 years after the LA riots. So that I think you can take into account too, like to try to explain to children how something as like, like obviously it's not meant to be like, here's race and here's race relations, but like this comic book really shows like the carnage of rioting, of people just acting crazy, of just absolute like lunacy. And I think that there is a parallel to be drawn there, that how do you introduce these concepts to young adults and sort of like speak it in a language that they understand?
Yeah.
I'm drawing conclusions.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, like, yeah, like that I said, like I said, no matter what you want to say about this comic, it's art because it gets you to think, and it's like, yeah, how do you introduce those ideas to young adults and be able to give it to them in a way that they can digest and process without becoming hopeless, right? Because I was a bit young in 93, 94 to know everything that was going on, but then as I got older into middle school and like the later years in the 90s, I think you hit about 4th, 5th, 6th grade, and you just start to kind of realize how fucked up and scary the world can be.
Yeah.
And it's important that kids have touchstones to help them understand.
I'm sorry.
Right?
I'm all slouchy over here.
That's all right.
So,
if you're watching this on video, you'll notice that I appear taller than Nathan. It's because I'm proportionally very, very weird, and I have all my height in my torso, but I have the legs of like a tiny fat baby.
Yeah.
Whereas Nate is a normal sized person, and he doesn't have like an abnormally long torso.
I am not slouching. I am just sitting back in my chair.
I'm sitting up straight. Even if I slouch, I'd probably still look taller than you.
But you know what? Who cares?
It's true.
So I got to read Preludes and Nocturnes. Again, I had never read Sandman. I didn't know anything about it other than the character was not the name of the comic book, which always confused me. I was like, okay, so the main character's name is not the Sandman? And this explained it. This did a very good job. interestingly enough, I had actually read a couple of death graphic novels.
Of course you did.
The trade paperbacks.
Yeah.
It's just so there was
Because she's awesome.
well, there was a girl that lived across the street from me when I was growing up, and she's a couple years older than me, and she was super into Sandman and death and like the whole.
So this is the girl who babysat you guys?
Yeah. So she's a couple years older than us, and I read a couple of those, but like it always was a little bit too highbrow for me. You know, it was just like I don't get it. I don't really care.
So explain to the folks at home who death is.
So that's a kind of a good question. From what I understand about like these entities, like death and dream, and these are characters in this comic book. From what I understand, these are kind of like very ancient, like celestial beings, like gods, essentially.
Kind of, yeah. They're all siblings, right? And they're called the Endless. And so death and dream, there's others, but anyway.
Yeah, but I don't know the details about that because basically I know what I read in here.
Yeah,
And
there's more about them in the others. I won't spoil it for you.
What I read in here is basically how the story starts is there's this family that are trying to conjure death for personal power, like you do. And they mess up somehow, and they end up with Dream. And Dream is like this tall, white,
Beautiful gothic specimen.
like, the messy black hair. But anyways, what you see is this guy, like dressed in like a cloak, and he's got like this weird gas mask on, and he's like unconscious. And basically this family imprisons him.
Do you remember Dream's name?
No.
Morpheus.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I makes sense, but yeah, that didn't stick with me. I just knew him as Dream.
Okay.
So he's imprisoned in this like ball basically for like a generation, for like 100 years almost. Like the guy that summoned him, the guy that conjured him passes away, and then the son passes away, and then there's all these like strange happenings that are occurring because basically Morpheus is the creator of dreams. Like these creatures, these gods, whatever they are, like death takes people, when they die, and Dream creates dreams, and he like has this dream world, and he uses these tools. These tools are like imbued with his powers. And so eventually, I don't remember exactly how he escaped, but basically he gets out of this prison. And once he's out of this prison, he has to go about the quest of retrieving his tools, like go home and rebuild the dream world. And so that the long and short of it, that's the story. And I'm not going to go into like every single detail.
You should read it.
Right. You should definitely read it. But it is a really good story. The part that kind of stuck out to me the most was there is, like towards the end of the book, he has, what was it, like a bag of sand? So, there's like a bag of sand, and there's this villain. I can't remember his name, but there's this villain, and he's got like a skull face. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And he's locked up, and he eventually gets out, and he retrieves this bag of dust. I can't remember his name, but he's like hallucinating.
Right.
And so he spends this to like 24 hours in this diner, like going through like all of these like torturous things with like this group of people in the diner. And it was one of the most messed up things I had read in a long time. I was like, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So pardon me for butchering it, but basically
I can't remember his name either.
yeah, I can't remember the name. But just it is definitely an adult comic book. We'll just put it that way. And like I said, I really enjoyed it. But yeah, it was one of those things where I kind of went a really long time without reading it. But like now I've got something that I can add to my repertoire and read more of them because we have more of them. But like it's probably like no secret. Like these are good comic books. I just never got around to reading them.
Well, I'm glad you read it. It's been a while. It's been, at least 4 or 5 years since I've read it, so I can't remember every single detail. My goal was to try and read both of them so that I could talk through it with you a little bit more, but Maximum Carnage just took me so long. Like, it's not even that it was hard to read it or that it took me long. It was that I so didn't enjoy it. It was work to find time to read it, right? But I wasn't able to get through both that and Sandman in a reasonable amount of time for us to do the podcast. So I guess the way I got into Sandman was because I was into Neil Gaiman. So I found out, I kind of came a little bit late to the Neil Gaiman party. In my mid-20s, I worked at, or my early and mid-20s, I worked at a used bookstore, and there was a guy I worked with that had like a tattoo from the Sandman series on his leg, and it was a pretty cool tattoo. I can't remember, I think it was of the key from the book, and anyway, he started talking to me about it, and at the time I was very much into graphic novels, but one day a book came across the counter that I saw had Neil Gaiman on it, and I was like, okay, well, I'll read this because he's the guy who wrote the Sandman, and so really likes the Sandman, and it was American Gods.
John Dee, by the way, was the character. I don't know if there's he has like a villainous name, but John Dee was the character.
Okay.
The skull-faced guy with the dream powder.
Gotcha. So anyway, I read American Gods and just absolutely loved it. Fell in love with the story. And then I went on to read some other novels that Neil Gaiman wrote. And then about this time, Coraline, the movie, which you will watch someday soon, came out. And I just loved it. Visually, it just really spoke to kind of my taste in animation, and went and picked that up. And I think, that was one of the first of many. I don't know if it was the first, but it was one of a few young adult kind of mid-age books that Neil Gaiman's written. He also did Stardust and The Graveyard Book, and so I really enjoyed those books. And then finally it came time where I was like, well, I got to read Sandman, right? Because I had read Watchmen, and thanks to the internet, I kind of had read some things about Alan Moore and had read some things about Neil Gaiman, and I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure Alan Moore was sort of like through networking kind of helped Neil Gaiman get his start into comic books. And since I really liked Watchmen and other things I'd read by Alan Moore, I was like, okay, visually Sandman's probably going to appeal to me, and the story I know is going to be good, and I really wanted to, because I only knew Neil Gaiman through novels, right? I wanted to see how it was different, how he was different in a graphic novel. And I'll have to say, like, I think he's good in both media. Like, he's really good. So, definitely, if you have never read Neil Gaiman before, it is very adult. It can be very adult themes unless you go to like The Graveyard Book or Coraline, or Stardust is a little more kind of middle of the road. There are really dark themes that are addressed.
Yeah.
But, maybe this is an ego thing. I don't know. But when I read Neil Gaiman books, for the most part, there's exceptions. I did not like The Ocean at the End of the Lane. I will throw that out there. That's another book that he wrote that came out a little more recently. I feel like it came out maybe in 2012. But when I read Neil Gaiman books, or I read the Sandman series, I just kind of feel cooler. I feel like I'm like in on something. Like I'm in on something that not everybody is in on. Like I got the inside scoop. I don't know. Like I've heard people comment about that before. Like, comedy nerds who are like, when they watched Monty Python as a kid, they felt like they were in on something that no one else really knew a lot about. And Neil Gaiman is still, I would say, probably not a household name, but his creations are. Like American Gods is a TV show now. And, Coraline was made into a movie. Stardust was made into a movie. Wouldn't be surprised if other books of his are made into movies. I think Sandman is very precious, and I think it'll be a hard sell to get that made into a movie or a show.
Yeah,
it's just too bizarre, I think. But anyway, yeah. So that's kind of how I got into it.
This is actually the first thing I've ever read by him. So
yeah,
I kind of it's just one of those things. It's like exactly the whole point of this podcast. It's one of those things where I had heard about it. The circles kind of so it's not the first thing, because like I said, I did read some Death, but like this is the first one where I conscientiously was like, oh, this is a Neil Gaiman work. Like I didn't read Death because I knew it was his, and I quite frankly I don't really remember it that well. So it's kind of like I recognize the artwork,
right.
So, but it's also it very much looks like it's kind of the time. like the late 80s, very early 90s.
Right. It's more of a serious adult comic, right?
Yeah.
Like,
and DC's really good for that.
Yeah.
You had mentioned The Watchmen, and, there's like DC's always kind of had a little bit of like bombacity when it comes to like more adult material. Like they're a little bit more willing to put out adult material. Whereas Marvel, I'm sure there's like adult-esque Marvel stuff, but it's only recently I found that they've kind of like started to stray from more like kiddie stories.
right.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed it. I probably enjoyed it more than you enjoyed Maximum Carnage. Although to be fair, it's kind of like a fully encapsulated story. Like
Yeah.
I don't need to read any more of it.
Right.
But I will. Yeah, it like that. One criticism that I had was just that like it also took place in the comic book world, and I felt like that was a little shoehorned.
Could you explain that a little bit more?
What I mean by that, like with the Gotham City references and the references to like the Justice League International and all that stuff, like I felt like that was very much like it didn't need to happen. Like this story, minus all the comic book stuff, could have just existed in its own world. I don't feel like it needed to be included. However, I get why it's there. I get why that's the thing, because like it's a comic book company and they want you to write material for their world.
Right.
So like I get it, and it wasn't done in a way that was necessarily very jarring. Like I think they did a good enough job, and I think that it's well written. I just, the artwork, like to me, the more serious stuff, it's a little bit more harder to digest from a comic book perspective.
I really like the artwork in it. That's probably one area where you and I would differ. I've really enjoyed the artwork in it. In the Sandman, Preludes and Nocturnes. And I liked the artwork in Maximum Carnage. It was really fun. It was poppy, it was bubblegummy, and I liked it. But I would say go ahead and check out Spider-Man Maximum Carnage. I would say issues 1 and 2, and then issues maybe 11 through 14 are really going to give you the bulk of the story and give you everything you need to know what's going on there. Of course, Sandman, read it all. Read it cover to cover. It's great. So what are we doing next podcast?
I have no idea.
I think we were discussing that I was going to watch the original Blade Runner.
Yeah, I think we should definitely do some movies.
Because I've seen Blade Runner 2050, the new one.
Yeah.
And
like
then
2049, I think.
2049, and then you were going to watch Star Trek Generations, which is the first Star Trek movie with the Enterprise crew.
Because we were like, let's do some sci-fi. Let's do some traditional sci-fi.
Yeah.
And of course, most conversations that we have about movies go like this. Really?
You've not seen it?
You
really?
haven't seen that?
Can't believe
Really?
you've seen that? Really?
Oh my
Yeah.
God. You gotta see this.
Yeah.
So,
So that be looking out for that. We'll try to get back into like more of a regular schedule. You could probably catch us at least every couple of weeks. But Nate is a busy guy working a full-time job and then putting out lots and lots of good content and podcasts for you guys. And I am a Renaissance woman and doing many things as well. But one way that you guys could support us is by rating us on iTunes. So I really want to thank the 3 people who've rated us on iTunes. We've got Dr. Grizzly, Finite, and then I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Vaguli Unez. So thank you, the 3 of you, for rating us on iTunes. It's a big help. You can also listen to the commercial either at the beginning or the end of the podcast about more ways that you can support Utility Muffin Labs. If you guys are watching this on YouTube, leave a comment and like it. If you're leaving, iTunes, leave a comment and like it. And if you think that some of this content is something that you would like to share with other people, please do so. And then if you have any suggestions on things we could cover in the future, just hit us up on Twitter and let us know.
alrighty. Well, thank you, Rachel. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Nathan. It is always a pleasure. We've
right.
got a LARP to get to.
Yeah, we're gonna go nerd it up. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you for watching. Definitely, if you like to see our faces in a sort of non-action way, sitting here talking to the camera, that'd be great. All right, cool. Well, until next time, I'm Nathan,
And I'm Rachel.
and we'll talk to you later.
Bye. Hey folks, this is Rachel from UtilityMuffinLabs.com. If you enjoyed the Playing Hooky podcast, think about supporting us. For more podcasts, art, videos, and gaming, go to UtilityMuffinLabs.com. Follow our podcast on Twitter, @HookyPodcast, on Instagram and Facebook at our Utility Muffin Labs name, and support us on YouTube at Utility Muffin Labs. Check out our other gaming-related podcasts, 25 Years of Vampire the Masquerade and the Nerd Words podcast. Thank you all for your support. Utility Muffin Labs, consistently rated adequate.